Hi. In this video, we're going to take a look at AppForms Designer's form properties and how you can utilize those to modify the design of your form. So I've opened up a blank form in the Designer, and as you'll notice, the Designer consists of basically three regions. On the left-hand side, you have a pane which shows the toolbar that contains all of the controls that you can add to the form, your data source settings, your rules pane, and also the workflow pane. In the center, you have the grid where the controls will be added to and where the bulk of the design will actually occur. And on the right-hand side is a properties sheet which shows you the properties of the currently selected object. In this case, there are no controls, so the sheet itself is going to show you the properties for the form object itself, and that's what we want to focus on today. So the first property you'll see is the name, and as that implies, that is simply the name of the form. So if you want to modify the name, you just simply modify this property, and when you save the form form object will now inherit that new name. The second property is the title, and this is just property for the form title, so if I want to change that, I can. Here you have the width and height settings, and those will control, obviously as implied, the width and height of the form. And one thing I would note is you'll see here in the grid there's a dashed blue line. And this is simply a visual guide to give you an indication of how wide and how tall this particular form is. So when you're designing, if you happen to, for whatever reason, let's say your design is such that your columns or your rows exceed the area of this blue line, then you're going to know there that what's going to happen is when you display the form, it's going to cut off that information. So anything beyond the blue line is not going to be shown or visible. So in the event that you do exceed it and you need to modify the size, then what you can do is simply go over here and let's modify the size of the width here to 750. It may need to be a little bit more, let's say 775. And so now we're within the scope of the width as denoted by the dashed line here, so we're good and we know that everything will be visible. In addition to the width and height, you have a background color, and this can be used to set the background color for the form. So if you want to set it, so we'll set it to maybe a blue color. So here's a blue color. You can set it to, if you want to apply a gradient, then this will allow you to pick a secondary color, so we'll pick pink. And so you'll get a nice gradient, and that can be set via the background color. The image property allows you to insert an image, and so let me pick an image that I know exists here on the server, and that will insert the image as your background. If you use an image, there will also be an image opacity setting that you can use to control the transparency of that image. So as you can see, as I've made it less than 1, the background color is starting to kind of bleed through the image. Next property is the enable close button. If this is checked, then what this will do is enable a small red X to show in the upper right hand corner of the form when it's opened at runtime, and the user may use that X. If they click on it, that will close the form. So there may be occasions, for example, you may want to apply business logic or apply some business rules that you have behind a button, and you want to run that when the form is closed. In that particular case, you may want to disable this property so that the user would not be able to bypass the button click to close the form. Next property is the is pop-up. This is kind of synonymous with the maybe a dialogue, maybe a more familiar term. But what this will do, if it's checked, then the form will open up kind of as a pop-up window versus just as an embedded window within the browser. Auto height, if you check auto height, you'll notice that the height property is now grayed out. And what will happen is at runtime, when the form is rendered, the height property of the form will be modified to and adjusted to fit whatever the content height setting is for the form. Form alignment, what this will do is there's a left, center, and right. It's default to left, so when you open the form, the contents within the form, or the form itself, is going to be aligned to the left-hand side of the browser window. If you want to change that to a more center or right align, then you can do that with this property. Form URLs. So let me click this. And what this is going to do is this will provide you with a direct form URL for either the runtime version of the form, or you also have one for the designer. We'll take a look at this a little bit more closely, or in a little bit more depth here momentarily. Cell padding. This is a property that you can set to control the default padding for the cells within the grid. By default, we use a 1-4-1-4, making the top and the bottom padding a little bit more, so that you get a little bit more centered effect of the text or the controls within the cell. Print page size. This is useful when you're wanting to either print the form out or export it to PDF. There's some pre-built and predefined sizes, also a custom property, and if you select that, you can then modify this print height, which is also useful, again, when you're printing or exporting to PDF. Last property here is check dirty. If this property is checked, what this will do is allow you to determine from within some business logic whether or not the form itself has been modified. Like, say for example, maybe a field on the form has been changed. If that's the case and this check dirty has been checked, then from within a rule you can implement a check of the is dirty property of the form, and then based on whether that's true or false, you may choose to implement some sort of action in either case to perform some sort of actions within the form to be able to handle that. So that's useful if you want to check and see if someone has made a modification to the controls in the form. The last thing we'll look at here in the properties pane is the export properties, and these are basically properties where you can control width, height, size, orientation, margin, and fit to width and auto height settings. These can be applied to the form and are useful when you're going to be exporting the form externally. Last thing I'll look at is I've selected a cell now, and you'll see that there's also another section here called selected cell style. If we expand that, you'll see that there's a height property and a column span. And so what this will allow me to do is if I set the height property, then that's going to modify the height setting for this particular cell. But because all of the other rows are kind of reliant on that, you'll notice that as I change that to 50, all of the cells that are within that same row also expand to 50. So this will allow you to, if you need to, resize the height property of a cell or a row of cells. Last property here is column span. Column span can kind of come in, it's almost like merging, if you're familiar with Excel, merging cells there. So what you can use with column span is, let's, for example, say I wanted to add a label control to the form that might display a title for the form itself. But I'd like to, when I add the label, I want it to kind of span the entire width of the form, or be centered across the width of the form. So right now, if I were to add a label to the form, whenever I go to, let me set the text here for the label. We'll make it larger, bold, and we'll center it. So what I'd want to do then in this case is expand it so that it fits and would expand across the entire span of the form. But as you can tell, if I do that right now with the current design, expanding the control is expanding the column width, which is thereby pushing all of the other columns off of the visible area of the form. So let me undo that part of it. What I can do with column span is, if I were to go select this first cell and set the column span to 4, since we have 4 columns across, you'll see that that cell now has spanning the 4 columns. If I drag my label up to this cell now, I can then expand the actual width of the label itself such that it now fits within the span of those 4 merged cells, and it now spans and is centered nicely across the width of the form. So that's where a column span can come in and be helpful. The last thing I want to cover, and let me undo what I just did again. Last thing I want to cover is dealing with the lock columns, and there's a checkbox here you'll notice. So with lock columns and is enabled, you'll notice that the column headers, or above the columns here on the top, is a sizing handle, and so when I drag that, it drags and expands the width or shrinks the width of the column that's currently being adjusted. But it does so for every cell within that column. And there may be a case or a time when you're working with a form that you might need to, or might want to have a particular cell have its own size and not directly affect the cells above it within that same column. And you can do that by unchecking this lock column. And you'll get a warning about it. And you click OK. Notice that my column adjusters now are gone. And when I click into one of the cells, if you expand the selected cell style, you'll notice that now I have a width and a height property, and my column span setting is gone. So if I want to now adjust the width here of this particular column, let's set it to, I don't know, 23. Notice that it adjusts only that column, and the other columns in that, it adjusts only that cell, and the other columns in that same, or cells in that same column, have not been modified. So that covers that aspect. The last thing I wanted to touch on again was the form URLs, and I want to touch on that in conversation with checking in and checking out of the form. So let me go ahead and save the form. And you'll notice that right now we have 2 buttons here, a check-in and an undo checkout. So in this particular case, this was a blank form, so when I opened it up, it's automatically checked out because it hasn't been saved or checked in yet. So if I go back to the form URL property that we had looked at, let me copy the direct form URL. And what this should do is give me a URL that I can use to directly access the form at run, and this can be passed to your user base for them to be able to open the form. So right now when I click that link, I don't really get anything. And the reason is that we haven't yet checked in the form itself. So when you check in the form, you have the option to publish or draft. If I choose draft, then it still will not be available, but for public use. But if I select the publish option and I check in the form, you'll notice that you'll get a watermark here across the form indicating that the form has now been opened read-only, and if I want to make any changes, I need to check it out. So now let's go back and try this direct link, this URL that we got previously. And now you can see I have the form, it's been checked in, it is now available via the URL, and the URL will take us directly to the runtime version of, or that form opened up in the runtime mode. Consequently, if I now come back and I want to modify the form, let me show you what happens if you don't check it out first. So let's say I add a button and a combo box, for example, and I think I've got everything I want done. I can't save it because, you know, it's not checked out, but these controls have been added. But now I determine, oh, I need to now check it out. To do that, once I go check out the form, it reverts back to what the state was whenever it was last checked in. So everything that you've changed prior to doing that have now been lost. So just a reminder to always remember to check out the form when you want to make a design change. Now, conversely, I have found the other functionality to be useful. However, if I want to simply test something, but I don't want to yet directly make that change. I kind of want to see what it looks like before fully implementing it. In that case, making the modification before checking it out, testing it using the preview is a good way to know whether or not that's something you want to do without, fully investing into the actual making the modification, then having to undo everything in the form. So hopefully this helps. I hope you found it useful. I would suggest that you review our other training videos that we have available for more in-depth tutorials regarding app forms, as well as how to implement various tasks within your app forms forms. Thank you.